welcome back to the Korean Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and of course, welcome back to our literature series of the podcast. And today we have a really interesting guest with some really fascinating research. So this is assistant professor in the Department of Asian Languages and Culture at UCLA, and this is Wang Sixiang. Wang Sixiang, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Jed. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely my pleasure, I promise. And this research of yours it's a deep look into language and linguistics, and it's also a deep look into history. So I might get you as a first question to begin to explain why this research is so fascinating, because for some people listening, they may think, oh, this sounds a little bit small and parochial, but it's absolutely not. It's so expansive and begins to explain so much about Ming China, Choson Korea, and the huge changes happening on the ground.
So the research project that this came out of originally was connected to a broader conversation about vernacular language in East Asia and how East Asian countries, including China, Korea, Vietnam, Japan, gradually, or rather suddenly in the case of Korea, by the 19th century, early 20th century, switched from using literary Sinitic, or as some will call it, classical Chinese, as the main official written script or language, and began to prefer their vernacular languages, right? So if you look at Japan, it's a shift from using classical Chinese and a lot of Chinese characters to having a mixed script hiragana. And of course, this kind of form was already existed in Japan, but now it became the official, it replaced literary Chinese in official documents. And you see this in Vietnam, where the Demotic alphabet took over. In China, there's a shift from classical Chinese to Baihua Chinese in literature and in official writing and education. And you see something similar in Korea, where instead of classical Chinese and text primarily in Chinese characters, we see this shift to the Korean alphabet. And for my students and for those who are familiar with Korea's history, I think they know that in 1443, King Sejong invented the Korean alphabet, and one reason for this was the sounds of his country, the sounds of our country, Korea, are different from that of China, and the language does not correspond, or the Chinese script does not correspond to ours. So there's this invention of the alphabet, and it was used in many contexts in Choson Korea after the invention, from the 15th all the way to the 19th century. But it never became an official writing system, in the sense that government documents were seldom used, except for a few exceptions in this script. Contracts, record keeping still used classical Chinese. But in the 20th century, of course, if you're in Korea now, you know that Hangul, or the alphabet that King Sejong invented, he called it the Huningjeongeum, which is the correct sounds to teach the people, is the main writing system used in Korea. You still see Hanja, Chinese characters here and there, but it's definitely not what it was like in the Choson period. So what my research was trying to do is to have us think about this process a little differently from the conventional narrative, which, if you're standing from the standpoint of 21st century and you are used to the alphabet as a medium, it just seems like a no-brainer that, when King Sejong invented the alphabet, of course, this is easier to learn, it fits the Korean language better, it's so innovative, why did it take 500 years for it to take on? And why is it that Koreans were still sticking to literary Sinitic? And one thing my work tries to challenge are these assumptions that one, we assume that language that we speak and the writing system that we use should somehow correspond. And this is not something that is necessarily the case in all cultures across time. This is something very specific to, I think, our context, post-19th century, post-20th century context, where we believe that language and script should be interchangeable in some way, or at least that the script should reflect spoken language. And that's a value system, that's a value judgment. But if we have that as the premise, that this is how language should be, then of course the Choson situation looks very weird. The second major misconception, or I wouldn't say complete misconception, is that the idea that the Korean alphabet was supposed to replace Chinese characters altogether. And that was not the case for King Sejong. And what my work wants to demonstrate is that for King Sejong, the alphabet was something that would be useful for representing spoken Korean, and it was. But he also thought of it as a way to help Korean scholars, students, children, learn Chinese characters, or at least learn how to properly pronounce Chinese characters, because the Korean script can also be used as a phonetic alphabet for literary Semitic. And King Sejong and the scholars that worked with him on not just the alphabet. I mean, there's a debate about whether King Sejong came up with it all on his own, or if the scholars helped him. But regardless, not just the alphabet, but all the linguistic projects associated with the alphabet was collaborative. And if you look at that, you'll see that how to teach people the meaning and the pronunciation of Chinese characters according to a national Korean standard was really on their mind. And you see this, and so what this means is that for King Sejong, the idea that Korean language and Korean conventions are different from Chinese does not mean to him that we need or that Korea should chart its own course completely separate from what's going on in Ming China, but that Koreans need extra tools to make sure that this connection can be preserved, or that Koreans can maintain knowledge over the use of Chinese characters, and he saw the alphabet as a technique for that. And one way for, in modern terms, you can think about the Korean alphabet was that it dealt, in addition to being a writing system for Korean, it also worked as something like an international phonetic alphabet. The idea was that the alphabet could be used to render the sounds of all languages, not just Korean. So King Sejong, his court applied the alphabet for the learning of foreign languages, including Mandarin Chinese, Japanese, Jurchen, which later became the Manchu language, Mongolian, and we also see Sidam script glossed in Korean character in Hangul or in this new alphabet. So this was a tool that had multiple functions, not just to demonstrate Korean uniqueness or to have a replacement for classical Chinese, which was not the idea in the 15th century.
So let's begin to build this story up. And I think I might start with a really interesting tale that you put in early in your piece from a Koryo Confucian scholar. So the previous dynasty, and this is Yi Sek, and he goes to the Chinese court, and he gets laughed out of there. The emperor laughs. This is the quote. He says, "Your Chinese is like that of a Mongol," and this begins to explain some of the difficulty, but it also explains the strained relationship there. Of course, Ming China has a certain amount of trepidation and caution towards the new Choson dynasty, and this runs back to some of the old historical hangovers from Koryo. Right. So I guess a little bit of background about Yi Sek is Yi Sek is actually a very important Confucian scholar in the Korean intellectual tradition. Many of his students actually were the high officials who helped found the Choson dynasty. So he's actually very well respected. And one thing that he achieved as a youth was he passed the civil service exams in Mongol-ruled Yuan China and became an official working for the Mongol Empire in China. And of course, living in Beijing, he was conversant in Chinese or whatever the Mandarin dialect of the time in northern China, maybe somewhat influenced by Mongol habits. And he was there for several years, but the Mongol Empire collapsed, and then he returned to Koryo. And something like 20, 30 years later, he gets sent as an envoy to the new empire in China, the Ming dynasty, which is ruled by the Zhu family, who comes from farther south, right, the Nanjing area, the Anhui area. And they throw out the Mongols, and they establish their capital in Nanjing. And of course, their speech, I mean, if you know anything about China, is, it's a big country where, depending on where you are, manners of speech are very different. And the Ming emperor, the first Ming emperor, wants to establish a new standard for pronunciation. So he based his hometown dialect
or made his hometown pronunciation the basis of this new standard. So it's close to the Nanjing dialect, and so it would have been different from what was spoken in northern China at the time. And so when Yisai comes to court and he's trying to have a conversation with the emperor, it's noticeable, the differences, right? And from the Ming emperor standpoint, he sounds like a Mongol. And it's not just that there may be an issue with dialect or his mannerisms, but the Ming dynasty and the Koryo dynasty never really they started out okay, but Koryo was politically unstable after the fall of the Mongol Empire, and there were different factions at court that some groups wanted to side more with the Ming, others saw Koryo as more closely connected with the Mongol Empire, which was much reduced in size at the time, and there were a number of coups, and some ambassadors were killed, so there was always friction. And in the beginning of the Choson dynasty, or at the end of the Koryo dynasty, rather, a general overthrows Koryo, and his name is Sixiang Wang, who founds the Choson dynasty. And the event that led to the coup d'état was the king of Koryo actually ordered him to attack the Ming army in Northeast Asia, what is now Manchuria. This war never happened because the general went back and overthrew the Koryo dynasty, established the Choson dynasty, and wanted to make peace with the Ming. But the Ming dynasty at the time was not exactly comfortable with Korea. Was it trustworthy? Did they still have ties with their rivals, the Mongols in the north? There's all these coups d'états, like who is this new guy, Sixiang? Can he be trusted, or is he just another one of these ambitious generals who's going to get overthrown himself? So there's a lot of uncertainty in the beginning, and this is built up by the fact that there's this cultural cleavage. And the other, I think, a third thing that adds to this is when Koryo was part of this larger Mongol world, Koryo elites were more culturally diverse, in the sense that many of them spent time in Beijing, many of them spent time with the Mongols. There were foreigners in Koryo, not just people of Mongol or Chinese descent, but also Uyghurs and Tibetans, and so the late Koryo landscape was more multi-ethnic, if you will, or at least there were different cultural traditions at play. And so one of the first chief interpreters of the new Choson dynasty was actually a descendant of Uyghur immigrants to China, who then sought refuge in Korea after the fall of the Mongol Empire. And so this was somebody who was competent in multiple languages. But with the fall of the Mongol Empire, the Koryo elite, or the Choson elite by now, are in some ways losing their intimate contact with this multicultural landscape. So there's this anxiety that, well, if we need to conduct diplomacy, where are we going to get fluent Mongolian and Chinese speakers if the elites are no longer spending a lot of their lives in these locations?
And that brings us into another diplomat, another scholar here. This is Sol Chang-Su. And this is interesting because he is formally disgraced. He is rehabilitated at the time to meet these new language requirements. And he doesn't just go, of course, and do the work, but he also has to present a plan for these for examinations for training new diplomats and new envoys to Ming China. And it's a difficult type of task. It's not just enough to learn the language, it seems, but this is a incredibly clerical type of language, documentary style. Of course, this is diplomacy. It's not just casual discussions on street corners.
Right. So the person you mentioned, Sol Chang-Su, is from that family, the Gaochang Xie family, the Uyghur lineage that immigrates here, and he establishes, I would say he reforms the existing Koryo bureaucracy, the interpreters bureau, and it gets renamed, and I think the major innovation, and the sources aren't that detailed about this, so a lot of it has to be we have to speculate a little bit, but my sense is that during the Koryo period, you didn't really need to train interpreters, you just needed to find them, because there are all these people who are going across borders, and they learn the language one way or another. but you had to bring them into court, into this bureaucracy, so that they get, you shape them up to be proper officials. But once you enter the 15th century, there's actually a problem of, well, we actually need to train them and assess them and make sure that they're practicing Chinese or practicing Mongolian. So the system he sets up, what we can see is that there's actually a curriculum for training language, and the Korean alphabet later in the 15th century is used to produce textbooks for this curriculum. And there's a debate about whether these textbooks are actually what people use to, let's say, learn Chinese, or if they're just a standard curriculum where you can test people to make sure that they know the basics. And I think it probably served a bit of both functions. And of course, the thing with interpreters is that they play this interesting role where they do all the dirty work in diplomacy, right? Because usually the people in charge of diplomatic missions are aristocrats, high officials, and they can't do bad things, right? They can't grovel, they can't deliver bribes. They have to maintain propriety. But if you needed something to be done under the table, you needed someone to spy, you needed someone to conduct the basics of diplomatic interchange, but not necessarily the things that are necessarily respectable. Well, you need a group of people who can conduct that. So the diplomats who are the interpreters coming out of the office of interpreters usually are not of aristocratic background, and I think that's one reason for that. And one thing, Jed, you said that was sort of interesting is that it's not just everyday conversation. That's true, but it also is everyday conversation, because if you think about how they had to, go from Seoul all the way to Nanjing and later Beijing, you have to deal with all the logistics of, what if your horse gets sick and you need to buy a new horse? What if you need to buy and sell vegetables, trade ginseng? But all these nitty-gritty things that make diplomacy possible, somebody needs to be carrying that out. And often it's these interpreters who have the linguistic skills to do that. And in addition, the higher ranking interpreters would often be the people who would conduct the more graceful aspects of this. So when the high officials meet one another, they're the ones in the room who translate the speech. Or if the king is meeting with the Korean, with the Chinese emissary, if the Korean king is meeting a Chinese emissary, you would have these interpreters. They would select somebody who could perform that role. But the vast majority of interpreters were actually the people doing the dirty work, if you will, or the practical side of things.
Let's talk about why this dirty work is so important for Choson Korea. You're right that this is very important for them, because being able to operate within the cultural and linguistic landscape of Ming China is exactly what Choson Korea try to hold as themselves and to separate themselves from the rest of all the other countries in the world. So it's not just it is a prestige status, of course, being so favorable inside Ming China, but it also comes with a lot of other important things here, like knowledge transfers and technology transfers. And I believe at one point, I don't have it in front of me now, but there's one point in your article you speak about a particular legal code that from Ming China that Choson Korean were simply misinterpreting for decades upon decades, and you realize the central importance of all of this.
Right. I mean, because here's the thing with language, is classical Chinese is rather stable. It changes over time, but the text, it's the same corpus of text, it's rather stable, but society changes, and language changes, institutions change. And so inevitably you will have new terms, you will have things that enter into, for example, practical things like legal codes, medical texts. I mean, these are some of the things that are not mentioned here. Technology. A lot of this is rendered in language that isn't in the classics, right? And so these linguistic specialists often are the people who are at the foreground of that translation. One of my colleagues, Hyuk-Hwan Kang, who teaches at the University of Washington, St. Louis, has this project on technology espionage in the Choson period. And you see that these interpreters are often sent, are the ones who are at the forefront of this. And they're the ones trying to figure out how Chinese artisans are doing certain things, and then they're the ones who are translating these techniques because they're getting this orally from the artisans, and they have to render that into text and then translate that into either Korean or classical Chinese so that their audience can understand that. So language is not just for diplomacy as we usually think of it, but all these levels of knowledge. And the example of law, I mean, it's just one of the many categories. Yeah.
Let's talk about the language training then, because this becomes really important. So a whole series of textbooks and language manuals are written around this time, not just explaining the alphabet, as you say, but also explaining how to properly pronounce these things. And a huge amount of time and effort goes into doing this.
Yeah, indeed. So, I mean, it's actually quite impressive, the corpus. And the alphabet really puts us under overdrive. So we do have some text, for example, Noble De, which some people understand this as Old Khitan or Old Chinese, and another text called Pak Tongsa, which is interpreter Pak. And these texts clearly date from something like the 13th or 14th century, possibly even older. But the earliest editions of these texts are only in Chinese characters. So you can think of them as language textbooks where it's sample dialogues, right? So we have dialogues about someone buying a horse and then finding out that it's not the horse that they wanted and they need to return it. You have sample passages where it's describing a party that's happening somewhere. I mean, all sorts of a wide range of linguistic life, right? Not just high diplomacy, but a lot of everyday things as well. But the original texts are simply written in Chinese characters. So you have the phrases and the lines, but there's no indication of how things should be pronounced. And my suspicion is that in the earlier period, when Korean pronunciation of these words were not that different from the Chinese standard, such as during the 13th century, when the Mongol and the quarter courts were rather close, it wasn't as important to indicate the sounds, and there was also no real ready-made technology to do so. But the Korean alphabet allowed the sounds to be indicated specifically. And what sort of gets discovered, I think, or recognized, I think people were aware of this, but is that Chinese language changes over time. And so what was the standard way of pronouncing something in 15th century? Once you get to the 16th or 17th century and you look at this old edition, these interpreters are realizing, well, the textbooks are wrong because the pronunciation is changing. So then every couple of decades, these textbooks get rewritten with new glosses. And there's some editions where you actually have multiple glosses, where there's a Chinese character is glossed according to how the Chinese reading should have been versus how it's actually pronounced at the moment. And so there's this reluctance to just sort of abandon the proper pronunciation in authoritative text in the past, but at the same time, there's a recognition that language is changing. So there's this, and this creates a dilemma about the relationship between text, language, and authority, because if your knowledge is based on, or your authority, cultural authority is based on mastery of something that is changing, how can that authority itself be stable over time? And I think that leads to some questioning, actually, among Korean intellectuals later in the 17th and 18th century about the nature of change, linguistic change, and difference. So they start to ask themselves questions like, well, if Chinese language is ever changing and Chinese characters don't have a fixed pronunciation, why do we need to be the same as Ming China or Qing China? Korea can carve its own path. Well, we can use our own alphabet or language to the exclusion of Chinese. Would that be possible? Would that not be possible? So these kinds of questions start to emerge once we get to the 18th and 19th century. That's the 17th. I mean, it's not. There's no moment where people say Eureka, but at least by the second half of the Choson period, scholars are taking these questions seriously.
how focused is this on Ming China? Of course, it is quite heavily focused there, but I have to imagine that all these realizations of the importance of interpretation of language and the transfer of knowledge and all that can be gained from it, it must have at least sparked a broader shift, or at least potentially sparked a broader shift to not just interpret and communicate with Ming China, but the rest of the world as a whole.
Indeed. I think this is a larger story, right? Because, I mean, realistically, from the 16th to the 19th century, Choson Korea was not in very strong contact with the wider world. I mean, in the 14th century, 13th century, during the Mongol Empire, Korea was really interfacing with quite a wide swath of Eurasia. But the period after, mostly it's China, Mongols, Jurchens / Manchus, and Ryukyuans and Japanese. So these interpreters also use these textbooks to document these languages. Actually, I'm not sure. I don't think we have anything about the Ryukyuan language, but for Japanese, Manchu, and Mongolian, we definitely have textbooks like the ones we have for Chinese. But of course, once you get to the 19th century, when European powers are entering Asia, it's actually these interpreters who are often at the forefront of dealing with this influx of new Western knowledge. And when you see the late 19th century and the early 20th century, it's often some of the key reformers in the Choson government are coming from this background. And I think their exposure to difference, linguistic difference, and also working in this context is exposing them to new ideas and putting them at a position where they can advocate for change. And to the very end of the 19th century, we have actually similar textbooks. There are a few that are extant for English, for example, where we see textbooks built on the same model as the Choson period, where you're using Hangul to gloss the pronunciation of English. And these are also created by people working in this tradition.
There's a very interesting point that we should open up a little bit more here, and this is kind of fascinating, and it gets into the tensions about translation and all the culture and history that is really embedded in this. And that is the early Choson court keeps the existence of the Korean alphabet a secret from the Ming officials. Right.
So, this is a question that is, how should I put it? I mean, in the article, I think I noted that there was a rule that said, we're not supposed to show anything written in the vernacular script, which is the Korean script, to foreign officials, to Chinese officials. And they don't say why. Right? What is the problem? What is the anxiety? And there are different ways to think about this. I think one is when the alphabet was invented, the opposition from some court officials was that, well, when the Chinese see this, are they going to think of us as barbarians because we now have our own script? Because all the other people with their own writing system are culturally different from China, and Koreans are civilized people. And I think one thing I should just point out is that we now, from a nation-state perspective, it's very weird to say that Koreans want to be Chinese. And it's not true on an ethnic level. And I don't think it ever was. But it was true on a civilizational level, where if you think about China as the equivalent of Rome or ancient Greece, and Latin as the equivalent of classical Chinese, what Korean elites wanted to say is that we are fully civilized and we belong to this world of the classical world, to this classical world, just like, let's say, a British scholar in the 17th century was proud that he can read and write in Latin and was connected to the Romans. I think it's akin to that, right? And but I think the difference is that there's this question of whether or not if people from China saw that Koreans were also using their own script, what would that signal to them? And the thing is, my guess is that the existence of the Chinese script was not really kept as a secret in the sense of that people in China just had no clue about it. One thing is clear is that after the Indian War, when the Ming army comes to Korea to rescue it from an invasion from Japan, I think China is aware that Koreans have their own local script, and they're not that bothered by it. It doesn't really become an issue. It's noted, it's mentioned, and it doesn't lead to this. But I think what's interesting from the Chosun perspective is that there's this anxiety of being perceived as not fully civilized, and I think it speaks less to whether or not the people in China would react one way or the other, but to a cultural anxiety that Chosun elites had. So even though they, I think, fully believe themselves to be rightful heirs to the classical tradition, they were also aware that this was a classical tradition that didn't begin on the Korean peninsula, and Korea was sort of coming into it late in the game. And so I think there is a bit of that cultural anxiety reflected in this question. There's also the possibility that not showing Ming ambassadors the Korean script or anything written in the vernacular is that they didn't want that there may be sensitive materials or information in some of these texts, and the court was just would rather just say, basically is just saying, if it's not a pre-approved piece of text, please don't show it to foreigners. And you see that throughout the Chosun period. So it could just be a blanket a ban on sort of being willy-nilly about interacting with foreigners, and they wanted to keep a very controlled orchestration of their own image. And of course, the court interpreters who were professionals were integral to that process.
I really hope you're enjoying this episode of the podcast, and I apologize for this interruption, but I'm just going to take this moment to remind our listeners that we've made a conscious decision here in the Korean App podcast not to run advertising in any way. So if you do enjoy the podcast, and you listen regularly, and you do want it to continue, it is important that you do your best to support us at the links below, or by sharing, liking, or commenting on the podcast across social media. All your help in this regard is invaluable. And now back to the episode. Let's talk about the training and the individuals here, because this is where I find this part incredibly fascinating. That this role of interpreters clearly is so important for Chosun Korea, and yet you write on numerous times throughout your article that there's just a complete lack of students willing to go into the training, and there's a whole range of reasons for this. And the first one is hierarchy, that the elite, or at least the sons of the elite families inside Korea at the time, see this incredibly important diplomatic role as somehow also beneath them.
Right, I think hierarchy is a big part of it, and there are a number of theories about why that's the case. But I think one thing, and this is not really developed in the article, is that the people who are interpreters, who really made this role very important, or when this role became very important in the 13th century, was during the Mongol invasions of Korea. And the people who were recruited for this role were whoever they could use to do so. And some of these people didn't come from very good backgrounds, but because they were good at language, they were indispensable for the court. But because of that, some of these individuals were able to upend existing hierarchies. So I think for the elite, the traditional elite in Korea, these interpreters, or the idea of interpreters, became kind of like, okay, these are the upstarts, people who climb the aristocracy but really aren't from that background, and they're just using a technique, not their moral cultivation or the prestige of their family background. They're illegitimate interlopers into the system. So when you get to the 14th and 15th centuries, the interpreters are still very important, but the Korean elite are basically saying, this is not something a profession that's good for dignified people. And this created a problem where, well, if the court wanted reliable people they can trust, and by that, partly, it's really a class thing, a class or social background thing, where these people are coming from the aristocratic Yanban backgrounds. Well, these people don't want to do this work. and you need incentives for other people to join. And it's also hard work because you're employed by the court. You have to travel to Beijing. Sometimes you have stories of interpreters who get sent on a mission. They come back, rest for 3 days, and they get sent again. And they spend half their life just traveling back and forth. Right? It's not an easy life. So that could be also part of it. And then there are stories of interpreters who die on the road, right? Who spend their lives doing this. So there are a bunch of factors. But I think this aristocratic bias against the interpreters create the situation where interpreters became sort of their own hereditary caste. And it also became an avenue for low-born children of Yanban aristocrats. So that is, if you have a talented son, but whose mother is not Yanban, who is in the Chosun social system, someone who is ineligible for service, for civil service, but they can fill the role of interpretation, which could be quite lucrative as not so much as a profession, but because you're engaged with international travel, you have the opportunity to trade, you're in a position of power. So it could be a good way out for some aristocratic scions who don't have the full credentials. And so by the 17th century, there's this, the term junin, or sometimes they call this the middle people. Really, it's actually just because they live in Seoul, a particular neighborhood in Seoul, and they all work for the state, and many of them are occupying these specialist positions, including interpretation. Some of them are painters, astronomers, doctors, and they become this semi-hereditary caste, if you will, who work in these specialist positions. And in a way, this solves this problem of not having people to work for this agency. But the period I'm looking at in the 15th century, this was still not stabilized. The court was really anxious that you wouldn't be able to get the right people for this, and came up with various ways to make sure people would be able to staff this agency.
That is, let's stick on that for a moment, because there's another aspect of that in your writing which I really did find interesting. It's on that question of morality and risk in some ways. And you write this, that this was seen as an incredible risk to some people, that these incredibly important language skills and this very narrow path towards communicating with this much larger empire was seen by some within the Chosun court as an incredible risk, because you could use it to usurp power if you wanted to. And this goes to the central theme of much of your article, with this incredible importance between power and language.
Right. Yeah, and a lot of this is coming out of the experience with the Mongol Empire, where we have concrete cases of powerful interpreters who are able to, they tell the Korean king one thing and they tell the Mongol emperor something else, and in the middle, they get what they need, right? And I think there's this anxiety about this. And there are some cases in the Chosun period of interpreters who manipulate the system in order to gain for themselves. But mostly in the Chosun period, they're profiteering from trade, for instance, right? They imagine a scenario where the Korean embassy is passing through a region of China, in northeast China, and then the local official says, well, it's usually a custom to give me 50 bags of ginseng. I mean, this is hypothetical. I don't have the figures here, but let's say he says that. Well, the interpreter could then go to his boss and say, the general here wants 60 bags of ginseng, right? And then where does the other 10 bags go? I mean, the interpreter, and who can check his work, right? The interpreter is the only one who can move between these languages, and he's doing the negotiation. So there's this persistent sense by the Chosun aristocracy that interpreters are not trustworthy. And some of these aristocrats who are going on diplomatic missions are doing it once in a lifetime. They're usually not career diplomats. So they show up, they're completely at the mercy of their social inferiors. So they're giving orders, they're saying, okay, once we get to Beijing, we're going to do A, B, C, and D. And then the interpreter says, well, we can't really do A because of 1, 2, and 3. We can't really do B because of 4, 5, and 6. But maybe we can do C, but we need to spend X, Y, Z. And how is the poor aristocrat who doesn't speak Mandarin Chinese, has no idea how things work in Beijing, has no personal contacts in this city? Where is he going to be able to ensure that this interpreter is telling him the truth? He doesn't know. And so sometimes they behave violently towards these interpreters. They give interpreters sometimes get punished for seemingly small infractions to just remind them of their hierarchy. But the reality is they're the ones who are running the show, and they have their own way of doing things, an entrenched bureaucracy with its own norms, I would say, and that may not make a lot of sense to their social superiors who don't have the hands-on knowledge. And this is, I think, the cause of a lot of this, hierarchy. Behind hierarchy, I think, is also an anxiety about the usurpation of power.
Let's talk about the other side of that then, and the Ming envoys who would meet with the Chosun interpreters. And you write, interestingly here, that there was discrimination, as we just mentioned there, inside Chosun Korea against Chosun interpreters. But there was also a degree of discrimination and looking down upon the other involved in the relationship between the Ming envoys and the Chosun interpreters. Right.
Yeah, I think a lot of that discrimination come from similar sources. I mean, the Chinese social system is very different from the Korean one. But if you look at the Ming system, interpreters, they also had interpreters, including interpreters for Korean, but they're not nearly as prominent in the diplomatic contact, and there are very much fewer of them. But of course, the Ming had interpreters of other languages like Persian and Burmese and actually Burmese maybe later, may not be a Ming thing, but of various Southeast Asian languages and Central Asian languages, Mongolian and things like that. But these officials are also occupying something much lower on the court hierarchy. And in a way, one thing you can think about, one way to think about interpreters is that they're sort of supposed to be a fly in the wall. They're supposed to, when these high officials are meeting, they're doing the talking in between, but they're not supposed to insert their own agency. And there's this idea that they're only good at languages, they're not really culturally refined, they're not real Confucian scholars. But some of these interpreters, at least according to the written record, were quite astounding in terms of their finesse and their learning. So there's one case I talk about where a Korean, a visitor to Korea from China, it's actually unclear when this happened because the source is a bit vague on this. And one thing they do, these Confucian gentlemen, when they meet, is they write poetry with one another. And this one Ming envoy writes a first line of a parallel couplet with his calligraphy, and calls the interpreter and says, "Hey, tell your boss to come over and match this verse." And instead of and the interpreter just says, "Oh, okay, this is very easy," and he just fills out the second half of the poem on his own. And this completely surprises the Ming envoy because he doesn't expect that kind of talent or ability to come out of the somebody who is his social and cultural inferior. And some of these anecdotes actually are passed down in the writings by interpreters themselves. So I think what this also speaks to is sort of an attempt by Chosun's professional interpreters to assert their own cultural commensurability or cultural parity with their social superiors, to say that, hey, we're also members of this civilization. We're equally qualified to and deserving of respect because we have also mastered the cultural the repertoire that is necessary to be a member of a Confucian elite literati society or culture.
I think that's a point worth pausing on for a moment as well, because that is really interesting to me, because a lot of people listening would think, yes, translation is just translation or interpretation is just interpretation. We can do this as seamlessly as possible. But as you mentioned there, this is Chosun Korea, and you have to go through this huge array, this huge dance of flattery and humility and appreciation. And as you mentioned, even poetry. This must have been an incredibly delicate line to try and walk at times for the interpreters.
Indeed, right, and I think this points to sort of how sophisticated the toolkit is, and I think that's one of the goals of this project, is to remind us that interpreters, right, that's the job title, that's what the agency is called, but to really flesh out what it is that an interpreter is doing, and to not take for granted the role of this mediator. And my point here is that mediation isn't just about moving words from one language to another, but also translating practices, right, and expectations. And I think most importantly, it's not just translation, but creating an interface between two different cultural and linguistic worlds that is shared. So the interpreter is actually, I think, creating something in this process. And it's that shared space between these different individuals that allow diplomacy to happen, because they're the ones who are enforcing what are the norms, what are the expectations, what are the practices, how should this relationship look like, and the interpreter is there to manage the everyday. And I think in this respect, I think in the 21st century, it's not that different, right? Because when we watch the news and president of some country visits another country, we see the speech that they give in the office in front of the podium, but we're not appreciative of all the steps that had to happen for that moment to show up, right? So the Ming emissary meets the Korean king, and we have the diplomatic record of what that meeting was. But we actually, in the Korean case, we actually have also quite a bit of how that moment was orchestrated and performed, not performed, but prepared, and the role that court interpreters played in that process.
I want to mention a particular translator here. Of course, I believe we mentioned him earlier when we were talking about those important manuals that were mentioned. This is Cho Se-jin. And this, I believe, this gets to some of the heart of this and this incredibly difficult job that these people are doing, but also, which we touched on a little bit before, it wasn't just that these people were seen as risks to society or hierarchically inferior, but also morally inferior in the language here. So you write that King Chungjong at the time held Cho as in incredibly high regard, but at the same time he fought this huge ongoing battle against the illiterati around him. He was impeached on numerous occasions. He was called immoral and base. This is a quote, unfit for high office. He's someone who, again, quote, ravenous with a base nature. This is more than just risk, and this is complete denigration and almost full-on attack against him.
Right. I mean, the thing is, ad hominem attacks are quite common in Chosun court politics. So we shouldn't take these accusations, at face value. But Choi Se-jin, he was. There are a few things I think we can say. I don't know if he was as corrupt as people say he was. And by corruption, they're talking about how he's using his influence as an interpreter to take bribes, right? So the interpreter is traveling back and forth. He's going to China and coming back. Well, if you're a high official in Korea and you want something nice from China, let's say you want this book, or you want a vase, or you want silk. Well, who are you going to ask to bring it over for you, right? There aren't really private merchants in this period in Chosun. So the interpreter is someone that you can, ask like for this favor. But he's not just going to bring you a vase. You're going to need to give him something in recompense. So this is the behavior that they're attacking, and I think it's probably pretty common for interpreters to do this. Their salaries are actually quite low, and I think it's baked into the system that they would be using some of these methods in order to keep things going. And I think if we take the accusations seriously, Choi Se-jin is probably getting quite wealthy from this. And this is a pattern that persists into the 19th century, where some of these interpreters are massive patrons of art and culture in Korea, precisely because they're involved with this international trade. But I think what I want to point out is not so much that Choi Se-jin is being attacked for profiteering, but the kind of language that they use to describe him, right? So the ad hominem, he's a base person, etc., is not ad hominem is not weird. It's pretty common in Choson, the moralizing discourse in Choson Korea. But I think the specific ways that they say he's corrupt is interesting because it's connecting his character, acquisitiveness, and greed to his identity as an interpreter. And then there's this reproduction or production of a stereotype that they're running on, right? Because if you were to accuse like a Yanban official of being bad, you may not use the same kinds of language to do so. So that's sort of what I was getting at, is that the language is really focusing on profiteering, and that's part of it. And I think the other side to this is that Choi Se-jin was tolerated and employed, and he was actually the author of many of the textbooks we've talked about, and the court appreciated him because he was invaluable. And I think this gets back to the other issue of hierarchy as well, because and we see this across the Choson period, is that sometimes the royal court employs individuals who are not of the social background of the traditional elite, and there's a kind of effort by the traditional office-holding elite to push back against that. So a different case is King Sejong. Many of his inventions or many of his scientific projects were carried out by this man whose name is can't remember at the moment, but he's actually quite well known, who was of slave background, but he was an artisan who could make things. So when King Sejong wanted a device made, he would call this person over. And because of this person was received a lot of attention and prestige, but the conservative, social conservative attitudes at court would say, well, this person is upending existing hierarchies. You're giving him too much attention. He's you're employing him beyond the normal criteria. And I think from our perspective, it may be a bit jarring to see, people who are talented discriminated simply because of their birth. But from the Choson perspective, where birth and qualifications are aligned so closely, they see this as corruption because they're upending the existing system. They're going against proper protocols by raising somebody to higher who is intrinsically underqualified to positions of power. So from the Choson perspective, this is our equivalent of nepotism, right? Like if the president makes his son or son-in-law an important diplomat, we would see that as nepotistic because it's going against the usual appointment channels. Whereas in the Choson society, where aristocracy is the norm, when you see people who are raised to high status despite their birth, they see that as corrupt because it's going against the normal protocols. So that's, I think, part of the cultural backdrop to the story of Choi Se-jin.
As a final few questions here, how does the office of interpreters and the importance it held sustain throughout the Choson dynasty? Because in 1894, with the Kabo reforms, it is suddenly abolished. So does it hold strong until that moment, or is there a wane in influence, or how does the office stand up over time? I would say that it was always important, partly because diplomacy became so routinized in the Choson period. So once it's established, I would say that it really is continuously functioning. And then there are, of course, reforms, mostly to expand its functions, all the way until the 19th century. Where I think there's a major expansion in the early 17th century, and of course there are adjustments that have to be made when the Ming falls and it's the Qing dynasty. But because these embassies that get sent to Beijing, or first Nanjing and then later Beijing, happen really 2 to 3 times a year, the interpreter's office always has something to do. So there's always work being done, and so this is a regular occurrence. So the agency continues because they're involved with these rather routine, I wouldn't say every day, but things that happen on a repeated regular basis. So it's institutionalized over time for that reason. The reason it gets abolished in 1894 with a couple of reforms, I mean, it's just part of this wholesale reform of the Korean government to adopt a completely, what they would call a westernized or modern system, and the
the agencies replaced with a foreign ministry. And this is because, well, all the other countries in the world have foreign ministries and embassies and diplomats, and they're working on a different institutional system. So if you have the Office of Interpreters that's following a different, an older system, it just doesn't, there's this institutional mismatch. But the reality is, I believe that it's actually the same personnel that work in the foreign ministry after. A lot of it, there's a lot of continuity, actually.
And a really interesting turn, which after you've written it on the paper, I thought I should have predicted this. You go on to write that, of course, many of the former members of the Office of Interpreters go on to play incredibly pivotal roles in the modernization efforts of late Choson Korea. Right.
Yes, indeed. After the couple reform, right? So this is something that is going a little bit beyond my usual research, but there's this wonderful book by Hwang that talks about some of these modernizing reformers after the couple reform, and how they're coming out of these Chewing backgrounds, and which include these interpreters, and they're, as I said before, are at the forefront of the reception of foreign knowledge, and they're involved with the assimilation of that knowledge into Korean society towards the end of the Joseon period.
Let's finish on a last question, and I think this is, I might actually read a quote from yourself here, and this is important because in some ways I might ask this question to get you to sum up a little bit, and people may have some queries about this. And I think the really importance of this, I'm not sure how you see it, it's a alternative narrative, of course, towards about the invention of the Korean narrative of the Korean alphabet, which so much of modern Korea holds tight within its nationalism. And I might read a quote from you here. This is important, I think. The elevation of the vernacular script to official status in 1894 was not a logical nor an inevitable development from the script's early invention, but was shaped by the particular political pressures, intellectual shifts, and changing cultural attitudes that characterized the late decades of the Choson dynasty. And I'm not sure how you see it, but for me, this really was an important way, because this challenges so much about modern Korean nationalism and the way that the alphabet and script has been hugged tight over the years, but also gives a lot of context here. So am I wrong here? And importantly, how would you sum up the importance of this research?
Well, yeah, I think that's I have a pretty good summary. I think it's one of the angles I wanted to bring out here. And I think it's just to think about the Korean alphabet's history beyond the story of, the story of how the Korean alphabet and the Korean script replaced literary Chinese. Because if you tell the story from that perspective, then you're taking the late 19th century, 20th century perspective. And I think I'm not saying that Korea should go back to Chinese characters or not. I think that's not the point here at all. But rather that, well, there are reasons, particular reasons, many very good reasons in the late 19th century to say, okay, we're going to abandon classical Chinese and focus on vernacular Korean and use that alphabet as the national language. But that has to be explained in the late 19th century and what's going on in the 20th century, why people care about that. But we cannot take their values, ideas, and concerns and project them onto King Sejong. So when King Sejong is inventing the alphabet, or when his intellectuals at court or the interpreters are using the alphabet, they're not using the alphabet thinking that we're going to use the alphabet to replace literary Sinitic or classical Chinese characters. That's not in their cultural mindset. It's just not part of the way that they're thinking about the relationship between language and politics and script and speech. So the goal of this chapter was, or this essay was, to help us get into the heads of people in the 15th and 16th centuries and how they would have thought about language. And I think it's just that, I would say that, of course, King Sejong was interested in creating a uniquely Korean alphabet, but he wasn't creating that alphabet as a replacement, but he was using it as an alternative, a tool, a device of mediation. And the word I like to talk, one way I like to think about it is that the alphabet is a technology. It's a technology for translation. It's a technology for representing speech And it's also a technology for cultural translation. And I think that's the point I wanted to make in the end with this project.
It's also a fantastic point to end on. The article that we've been speaking about today is called The Sounds of Our Country, Interpreters, Linguistic Knowledge, and the Politics of Language in Early Choson Korea. And of course, I'm going to link that below. I encourage people to go and read it for themselves. We just brushed over it mostly today, and we had to run across so many important themes. So please go down the bottom and read it for yourself, as well as I'm going to link below a link where you can read more of Sixiang's work, not just in this area, but in a much broader context as well, which again is incredibly fascinating. And again, we didn't have time to speak about today, sadly. Sixiang Wang, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you, Jed, for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. This is just a final reminder that we've made a conscious decision here on the Korean Now podcast not to run advertising. And so the podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener. So if you do want it to continue, please consider supporting the podcast at the PayPal or Patreon links attached below. Or importantly, you can share, like, or comment on the podcast across social media. And on that, I hope to see you again for the next episode. Thanks again for listening.